Welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I would share with you the history of a single manuscript. And the reason I'm doing this is because you've shown a lot of interest in the book history parts of this channel, especially when I did the whole, what gives a book that bookish smell and other types of videos focusing on sort of print culture. And you've asked me a lot of questions about conservation work and preservation, what's the difference. So I'm going to talk to you about the Beowulf Text, and I will be referring to it as the Beowulf Manuscript, even though its actual title is the Cotton Vitellius MS A15, and we will discuss as to why that title has been attributed to it. But I will take a look at what this manuscript has been through in 1,000 years, why it's important, and how it was preserved over time, and all the things that happened to it. I find it fascinating, and I hope you do too. So I'm really gonna nerd out over this, and I hope you enjoy it. As I mentioned before, conservation means when you're actively engaging with chemicals on a manuscript and doing active repairing. Preservation is kind of a plan you have for how you're going to continually preserve a manuscript you already have without actively using chemicals on it. I'll also be using the term bibliographer in this video, and in this case, bibliography refers to the people who are kind of like Sherlock Holmes, but only with manuscripts and rare books. There's an entire book that I read on it in my studies, and it's an introduction to bibliography by Philip Gaskell. I would highly recommend this if you're interested in this kind of stuff. It's been very useful to me. Okay, so Beowulf. Before I say anything about the actual manuscript, let's talk a little bit about what it is. It's an Old English epic. It's a poem. It's about 3,182 lines, and it follows a Swedish man named Beowulf, who is invited at the mead hall of King Hrothgar, who is having difficulties because a monster named Grendel keeps harassing him and his people at his mead hall. Now, Beowulf has 3 challenges in this epic poem. First, he must defeat Grendel, then Grendel's mother, and in the end, he has to defeat a dragon. And the dragon does resemble Smaug a lot. We'll come back to that later. And the epic ends on one of the most beautiful funeral scenes I've ever read, and that is another video for another time. But I will say that the funeral scene in Beowulf, in text format, in poetry, resembles strongly what was actually found at the burial at Sutton Hoo, the ship burial. So there are a lot of elements kind of working together from what we have from the Anglo-Saxon period and how it connects to this epic of Beowulf. Now, scholars believe that the poem was placed into text on paper in the year 1000. Some say it's late 10th century, others say it's early 11th. They both have their reasons. However, the year 1000 is kind of the general consensus. Some other scholars have tried to date the oral poem itself based on syntax, language use, the naming of the clans, and they decided that it's around the year 700 that the poem was actually composed orally. So we're looking at a 300-year gap between when the poem was composed and placed in text format on paper. Another important year for Beowulf is 1936. In this year, JRR Tolkien wrote and gave a lecture called Beowulf, Its Monsters and Its Critics. This lecture put Beowulf on the map. It made people pay attention to it, and it suddenly became part of the Old English curriculum. It got placed in English classes. People paid attention to it, and Tolkien himself extracted many elements, including the dragon and other things from the poem and the culture and a lot of the elements, and placed them into the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. And due to the large success of those things, basically, I'm not saying Beowulf is responsible for the entire fantasy genre, because there were a lot of other people working on fantasy around Tolkien's time period, but I don't think we would have dragons the way we have them now, or a lot of magical and fantastical elements. So in that respect, yes, Beowulf is very important because ultimately it created the fantasy genre as we know it today, and I stand by it. I think without Beowulf, there would be no burning of King's Landing. But let's move on to the actual manuscript. First, what can we tell about the manuscript just by looking at it as if we were Sherlock Holmes. Now, I will have to mention that the manuscript is under the copyright of the British Library. Some of the slides I will show will contain some elements from the British Library's website, but I will cite everything down below safely, and I'll tell you that a lot of the information I've collected for this video does come from the British Library itself, from the University of Kentucky, and from several other texts, like the introduction for this 4th edition of the Beowulf Text, and several others, including this little British Library manuscript book. So now, we know the text was written around the year 1000. According to the British Library, we do know that the manuscript was produced by 2 scribes working in collaboration, but whose handwriting suggests that they were trained at different times and were significantly different in age. The first scribe copied the text at the beginning of the book, together with the opening part of Beowulf itself. His counterpart, clearly working at the same time and place, took over the middle of a line and brought Beowulf to its conclusion, besides adding Judith. To judge by his handwriting, the second scribe was trained late in the 10th century. The first, in contrast, writes a script more typical of the period after 1000. The most likely time for them to have collaborated in the early decades of the 11th century, possibly during the reign of Athelred the Unready, when England was subjected to waves of Danish attacks. The script itself is insular writing and a clear result of communal collaboration. So these scribes would obviously be working in a monastery. The manuscript's place of origin is also uncertain, but the poem's language is late West Saxon, but preserving earlier dialectical forms. Given that we have no other proof in writing, academics have speculated and agreed that the manuscript remained in a monkish community until King Henry VIII had the religious revolt and reform across England. That's as much as we can extract from the manuscript just by looking at it and examining the writing and the scribbles and the paper. So now we can start looking at its patronage. Patronage in the library world means looking at who has previously owned a book. So, for example, sometimes a book can be more valuable, not because of what it is, but because of who owned it. So, for example, if this little paperback copy of Beowulf was mine, it would probably mean nothing. But if this is Barack Obama's copy and he wrote in the margins of it, it's suddenly one of the more valuable books on the market because it belonged to someone important. So the first person to actually write his name in the manuscript was Lawrence Knoll. According to Kevin Kiernan, and he's a very important person and we'll come back to him later. Now, Kiernan argues that Knoll might have acquired the manuscript as a gift from William Cecil, the first Baron of Burghley, in 1563, when Knoll entered Cecil's household as a tutor to his ward Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Knoll himself was a pioneer in Anglo-Saxon studies, and his signature on the opening leaf of this manuscript is dated 1563. So the image you see on the screen now is the Lawrence Knoll inscription on the recto side of page 94. Now, the inscription is not on the first page of Beowulf because the Beowulf manuscript is part of a larger collection within the Nowell Codex. The Knoll inscription is on the first page of the Homily of St. Christopher. So soon after, the manuscript found its way to Sir Robert Cotton. Now, Cotton was a politician and a collector of manuscripts as well as printed books and other antiquities. So this is where we are so far, and this is what the manuscript has been through up to this point. Okay, so Sir Robert Cotton is fascinating. He had this incredible way of cataloging his books. So he had this giant library, and he had the busts of Roman emperors. And every shelf had a letter alphabetically, so like ABC, and then on each shelf he would look at the books numerically. So this particular codex was under Emperor Vitellius on shelf A, and it was the 15th manuscript. So that's why we call it now, the manuscript is the Cotton from Cotton's collection, Vitellius because of the emperor, A because it was on the first shelf, and 15 because it was the 15th codex. So that's how the library was later on cataloged as a whole. Now, that said, Cotton also had this really bad habit of sewing manuscripts together that had nothing to do with each other. So the Knoll Codex was now sewn together with the Southwick Codex, and together they were this longer manuscript name. So all of the contents of what this one book had nothing to do with each other. It was just kind of put together without any logic. He might have had some, but we can't really tell for sure, but none on our part. And also don't forget, because paper was very rare to find, sometimes the end pages or what was in the covers to kind of stuff it and make it harder would sometimes include manuscript pages from other manuscripts or biblical texts. And in this way we have found some really cool manuscripts that were lost, or you know, random things that are worthy of study sometimes, because you can find really cool bits. After Cotton passed away, Reverend Thomas Smith and Humphrey Wanley were hired to catalog his library. Their correspondence survived, and what we know from it was that the Beowulf manuscript itself was identified by name for the first time in an exchange of letters in the 1700s between George Hicks, Wanley's assistant, and Wanley. In the letter to Wanley, Hicks responds to an apparent charge against Smith made by Wanley that Smith had failed to mention the Beowulf manuscript when cataloging Cotton Vitellius A15. Hicks replied to Wanley, "I can't find nothing yet on Beowulf." One theory is that Smith failed to mention the Beowulf manuscript because of his reliance on previous catalogs, or because he had no idea how to describe it, or because it was temporarily out of the codex. Cotton, however, hired a librarian named Richard James to write an index at the beginning of the two combined codices. This is what each of the manuscript contains. These two were sewn together as one volume, even though they have a separate history. So while Beowulf is in the second codex, it's still part of one larger volume, including all of this other stuff. Sometimes when scholars refer to Beowulf in papers, they will just refer to it as the Nowell Codex. However, others, or most catalogers and bibliographers and librarians, just kind of go with the Cotton Vitellius name for the entire manuscript. So you might see either or, and that's why, because technically they're two, but it's also one. So it's kind of your choice. After Cotton passed away, his son and then grandson inherited, and by 1702, the Beowulf manuscript was given to the nation and eventually moved to the Ashburnham House at Westminster. This particular manuscript was there, untouched and unstudied, and it was just left alone. In time, some parts of it deteriorated. I mentioned it was bound in leather, and the pages were parchment, so it was susceptible to pests and mold. It had survived about 700 years this far, and on October 23rd of 1731, there was a massive fire where hundreds of manuscripts were severely damaged, either by the fire or the water, and 13 of them were completely destroyed. The collection was moved to the British Museum in 1753. But the manuscript remained in its original binding, and mothering was done to sort of stop the dry, brittle pages from disintegrating. In 1786, about 50 years after the fire, Danish scholar Grimur Johansen Thorkelin came to the museum looking for documents relating to Denmark. He made 2 complete copies of this manuscript, the first time ever that a copy was made for this manuscript. One by a professional copyist and one by himself, Thorkelin. Now, Thorkelin returned to Copenhagen, which was then bombed in 1807 by the British because of the Napoleonic Wars. And Thorkelin's house burned down, but the 2 transcripts were saved. So this kind of aided Thorkelin in producing the first printed edition of Beowulf in 1815. Now, this is where we are so far. And this is how much has happened to the manuscript up to 1815. The original manuscript back in England was severely deteriorating, keeping in mind that there was no one there tending to it. No one knew it was important, and it had just survived the fire. The margins and even some of the text itself gradually crumbled. Because Thorkelin brought Beowulf to light, in 1833 there were preparations for the first modern English translation. or English, modern English, edition of Beowulf. So the manuscript was brought up for examination when for the first time curators noticed that the neglected manuscript was in critical condition. As mentioned at the beginning, Tolkien made a huge presentation on it in 1936, and at this point it was studied for its content. And luckily Thorkelin's transcription of the manuscript helped us piece the missing text together. So in 1845, the British Museum took steps to preserve what remained. The manuscript's restoration is owed to Sir Frederick Madden, keeper of the manuscripts at the British Museum, and Henry Gough, who rebound its leaves in 1845. They mounted each leaf on a paper frame, and the manuscript was rebound. The tape still obscured some of the letters, as you can see in this figure right here. The tape is on the sides and you can still see it. The translation used frequently before more translation appeared was the one that William Morris made, associated with the crafts movement, and it was published in 1895 as The Tale of Beowulf, sometime king of the folk of the Weather Geats. In 1973, the British Library took the manuscript, and that's where it remains to this day. And here is where the works of librarians and preservation people comes into play. And I was curious as to how they displayed this manuscript, how often, and what do they take care of, and if any treatment has been done to the manuscript since it's been in the British Library. Now, these are the responses I got in an email. I sent them to the curator of this particular manuscript. So the Beowulf manuscript is regularly displayed, so not always, in the Sir John Ribble Gallery, Treasures of the British Library, under controlled temperature and light conditions. The amount of time it can spend on display is carefully regulated, and it is frequently removed for periods of rest. And in response to my conservation question, it was said, "Dear Andrea, I asked the curator responsible for the Beowulf manuscript, and he replied as follows: I'm not aware of any information we hold about the conservation of the Beowulf manuscript, as this hasn't happened since I've been at the British Library for about 15 years. So that's what I got. There are other bibliographers other than Thorkelin who went to do copies of it. One of them was Connie Bear, and another one was Frederick Madden, and they contributed to kind of studying the text on paper, and their copies are wonderful as well. One of the most famous translations of Beowulf is Seamus Heaney's, because he tries to maintain a folk song, a meter to it, or a folky sounding translation, and I think this contributed greatly to his Nobel Prize winning. And another one, which was published recently by Christopher Tolkien, was the one that Tolkien himself had done back in the day, but he never published it in his lifetime. So they published it recently in 2016, so you can probably find it on the shelves. But, you know, again, his lecture was the one that kind of put it on the map more than what he's done with the text itself. So now in 1984, Kevin Kiernan, remember we talked about him briefly, he decided to start a digitization project for Beowulf. Mainly because a lot of people now want to study Beowulf, and they want to do this bibliography sort of study, but there's only one manuscript and many of us, and you know, you pull out the manuscript many times, people touch it, people look at it, you really risk it being damaged considering how much it's been through already. So it's very good for us to have an interactive medium where we can look at each individual page, but without damaging the manuscript itself. The collaboration was done between Kiernan, and the software engineer was Romanian Ionuț Emil Iacob, and they used JavaScript. And they just finished this project in 2013, and it was like fully launched, I think, in 2015. It's a fairly recent project that just came to conclusion, but it took about 30 years to do, if not more. So it's an extraordinary project. If you're wondering which kind of people would look at stuff like this, honestly, well, not just medievalists and Old English scholars, but bibliography students, book history people, people working on the current Dictionary of Old English. They're only on letter like G, I think, or F. And it takes a lot of effort to kind of examine all of this stuff, and to go all the way to England every time, it's just not doable. So this is actually very helpful to a lot of people who want to study medieval texts, especially Beowulf, obviously. Now, what's really cool is that Kiernan did not only digitize the original, he also digitized Thorkelin's, Conybeare's, Madden's. And if you look on the image on the screen, you can see how you can align it with the other editions and simultaneously use them and interact with each transcription and use it as a study guide in translation for content, but also to study the differences. Now, by comparing variations in the different copies and through different lighting, Kiernan observed that Nowell, or post-medieval forger, might have tried to freshen up some of the writing, as it's visible through the layers of ink on the palimpsest. And Kiernan preserves and shows how his digitization projects have all these details revealing the long history of the manuscript's provenance, such as the script and inscriptions and so on. So he tries to maintain all of that in its digital form. He really tries to give you the full experience as if you were handling the manuscript yourself and studying it closely. But if you're wondering like what software they used and how they stored it, I'm just gonna put it up on the screen and you can pause it if you're interested. I'm not gonna read this out loud. You might be thinking, okay, so that's it. The Beowulf's been digitized, this is the manuscript, and that's its final form. Well, no, because from now on, there are so many things we could do to study further what people do with this stuff. So what I did is I kind of just took a screenshot of that first page of Beowulf, and I did a Google reverse image find. And what I found was incredible. I got to see readerships. I got to see how people interact with this first page and where they used it. I found it in a Reddit argument, like there was a fight about what Old English looks like, and someone pulled up this page. I found it in a BuzzFeed quiz about who you would be in a different lifetime or something, and this was part of their answers. I found it in people's blogs. I found it in like history blogs and websites. People have interacted with this first page in so many different ways. I found it as a Kindle screensaver and all these different methods. So at this point, we can really look at what more people do with this text and these images, and it's really fascinating because it almost adds like a totally different layer to what we could do with this manuscript and look at how people engage with it on like a personal level. I will mention that everything I just said I have put in text format, and I will link it down below, and everything is cited. And I will mention again that all of the images are copyrighted for the British Library and the University of Kentucky. Always respect that if you're gonna do anything with it further, and make sure to cite it properly and link to it. I will link a few resources down below and a few adaptations for films, graphic novels. There's a lot to work with and it's super fun. I'm hoping that maybe you can see through this video just how much work goes into the preservation of just a single manuscript. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching if you've made it this far, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!